Welcome students. What do you see in this video? You can see oxygen being inhaled into the lungs. From the lungs it is transported to the heart, from where the blood containing oxygen is pumped into the systemic circulation. Today the class is on transport of oxygen. The objectives of the session: at the end of the session, the student should be able to describe the transport of oxygen in different forms in blood, release of oxygen to the tissue, oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve and the factors affecting oxygen dissociation curve. This comes under the physiology competency 6.3. How oxygen reaches the tissue? What do you mean by oxygen delivery? Oxygen delivery is the volume of oxygen delivered to the systemic vascular bed per minute. Which organs are involved in this oxygen delivery? You have the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system acting together in achieving this task. In the respiratory system, you have two activities. One is the alveolar ventilation, which transports the atmospheric air inside the lung, and you have the alveolar capillary diffusion occurring across the alveolar capillary membrane. You have an alveolar capillary membrane where diffusion of gases occur. Next comes your cardiovascular system, where the heart plays a very important role in giving the cardiac output, and the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood also is very important in oxygen delivery to the tissue. Coming to the partial pressures of oxygen. In this picture, you can see air is moving from the atmosphere into the lungs. As the air is entering into the lungs, in the alveoli, you have the capillaries surrounding the alveoli. It is in the alveolar capillary junction the gas exchange is going to occur. As the air is entering inside, what happens? It reaches the alveoli. Before it reaches the alveoli, the saturation of oxygen is decreasing. The partial pressure of oxygen is less. As air moves from the atmosphere into the alveolar air, the partial pressure of oxygen falls to 104 millimeters of mercury. Why is this fall? Here, as the air is entering, you have humidification of air, which adds around 47 millimeters mercury of your water vapor pressure. Then you have the dead space air, which also will dilute the atmospheric air. Then as the blood is entering into the pulmonary circulation, as air, the gas exchange has occurred, and as the blood is leaving the pulmonary circulation, in the pulmonary capillaries, it is around 104, but as it enters into the heart, there is a drop in the partial pressure of oxygen. The arterial blood, which is pumped out of the heart, has a partial pressure of oxygen of just 97 millimeters of mercury. This is because of the physiological shunt, which I will be explaining to you now. Then the interstitial fluid has a partial pressure of oxygen around 40 millimeters mercury, and the partial pressure of oxygen in the venous blood is also 40 millimeters of mercury. In the intracellular fluid, the average partial pressure is just 23 millimeters of mercury. Here you can see this is the partial pressure. In the venous blood, it is 40 millimeters of mercury. As the blood is entering into the lung, there is oxygenation, there is increase in the partial pressure of oxygen, but the blood reaching the heart has a slight decrease in the partial pressure. Then as it enters into the systemic circulation, the oxygen is removed from the capillaries for the utilization of the tissue. Therefore, there is a fall in the partial pressure of oxygen. The transport of oxygen involves three steps. The first step is uptake of oxygen by blood in the lungs. Next comes the transport of oxygen, and next the delivery of oxygen to the tissues. This you are all familiar with. You have the alveolus, you have the capillaries, you have the alveolar capillary membrane. What factors will decide the diffusion? You have the partial pressure difference across the membrane, which favors diffusion of oxygen from the alveoli into the capillary, and diffusion of carbon dioxide in the reverse direction. The surface area, when the surface area of the alveolar capillary membrane is more, again the diffusion is more. The thickness of the membrane will have an inverse relationship with the diffusion, and the diffusion capacity of different gases will play a very important in oxygen uptake in the lungs. This graph you are all familiar with. You have the partial pressure of oxygen, you have the time duration for which the blood remains in the pulmonary capillaries. Here, as the blood is flowing through the pulmonary capillaries, you can see as the blood enters the pulmonary capillary, the arterial end, the pulmonary artery carries the deoxygenated blood, and the partial pressure is just 40 millimeters of mercury. As it flows through the pulmonary capillary, it is getting oxygenated. You can see by the time the blood flows 1/3 the distance of the pulmonary capillaries, maximum oxygenation has occurred. This is a very important safety factor in the lung.